My name is Michael Thompson. I'm a preschool teacher here in the United States, and over the past 12 years I've been in classrooms that have taught me more than any textbook ever could. After taking medical leave, I came back ready to start fresh. The district assigned me to a public preschool run by the local school district, and they told me it would be a diverse class. When I showed up on that first morning, it was still dark outside. The faint smell of burnt coffee drifted out from the teacher's lounge, mixing with the distant sound of the bell signaling the start of the day. I walked into my classroom with a stack of folders full of names I didn't know yet. I sat down at the little blue table, took a deep breath, and started reading the roster. 40 kids. My eyes skimmed through the reports. Half of them had some type of learning challenge. 12 had an autism diagnosis. Some had carefully typed individualized education programs, IEPs, with detailed goals. Others had 504 plans that, in theory, guaranteed accommodations. But I knew from experience that too often they stayed just that, plans on paper. I sat down at the little blue table, took a deep breath, and started reading the roster. 40 kids. My eyes skimmed through the reports. Half of them had some type of learning challenge. 12 had an autism diagnosis. Some had carefully typed individualized education programs, IEPs, with detailed goals. Others had 504 plans that, in theory, guaranteed accommodations. But I knew from experience that too often they stayed just that, plans on paper. On paper, it didn't scare me. I'd taught children with a wide range of needs before, but in practice, I quickly realized this was going to be a whole different kind of challenge. Within the first hour of class, I saw there weren't enough paraprofessionals to meet the demand. At some tables, 2 children needed one-on-one support. At the same time, no one came. The adapted materials that were supposed to be ready simply didn't exist, and the few I found were outdated, with yellowed pictures and text printed in Comic Sans, like we were stuck in 2005. The teaching strategies were straight out of the last decade, endless worksheets, activities with no visual or sensory supports. It was a model that didn't even come close to meeting the actual needs of these kids. What hit me the hardest was the silence. Nobody was talking about real inclusion. It felt like a nice buzzword for staff meetings, but in day-to-day practice, it was nowhere to be found. In the trenches of the classroom, the reality was different. Overworked teachers, frustrated kids, and a system frozen in time. The most frustrating part, finding out the district hadn't offered a single training before I started. No professional development on crisis management, no training in alternative communication, no strategies for adapting the curriculum, nothing. It was as if they expected me to just figure it out, like good intentions could somehow replace technical knowledge. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about teaching. It was about fighting against a broken system that left both teachers and students without the support they deserved. The most frustrating part, finding out the district hadn't offered a single training before I started. No professional development on crisis management, no training in alternative communication, no strategies for adapting the curriculum, nothing. It was as if they expected me to just figure it out, like good intentions could somehow replace technical knowledge. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about teaching. It was about fighting against a broken system that left both teachers and students without the support they deserved. On my second day, during the morning recess, I noticed something that wasn't written in any manual, but spoke volumes about the school's culture. It was rehearsal day for the Thanksgiving performance. The kids were gathered in the gym, sitting in a semicircle while the music teacher played the piano. I looked around and realized some students weren't there. Most of them had an IEP or a 504 plan. I asked a colleague, "Where's Ethan?" She replied, without even looking up, "Oh, he never sings. It's easier if he stays in the resource room." Something that deeply bothered me was seeing how, little by little, some team members stopped inviting autistic kids to certain activities. They never join in anyway, they'd say. And so, silently, exclusion became routine. At that moment, I understood. It wasn't that the children didn't participate. It was that no one invited them, because it was too much work, because they wouldn't follow instructions. The exclusion wasn't open, cruel, or declared. It was silent. And for that very reason, even more dangerous. I remember a sunny day in the schoolyard. Music time was happening outside. A teacher was leading the circle, singing with the children who had gathered there. I was nearby, singing along and watching the little ones who preferred riding their bikes. That's when I noticed Paul, an autistic boy I had never seen sing before. He was pedaling slowly but humming the melody. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but I recognized the song. I walked over. "Hey Paul, do you want to join music time?" Before he could answer, the other teacher, without even lowering her voice, said, "He doesn't do group activities." I pretended I hadn't heard her. I leaned toward him again. "What do you think, Paul? Wanna try?" He stopped pedaling. "Yes," I smiled. "Okay, can you please get off the bike? I'll take you to the group." "No," he said. "All right, please get off the bike and I'll carry it with us so you can sit for music time." He thought for a moment, then got off. Without a word, he took my hand. We walked over to the music circle, and there he sat for the first time to join a group activity. I went back to singing, but my eyes stayed on him. It was just a children's song, a few simple verses, but for Paul, that moment was huge. For me, too. From then on, in every daily activity, story time, art, recess, I made a point to invite everyone, because inclusion isn't about who usually participates. It's about making sure every child gets the chance to try every single day. And then came the conflict. Part of me wanted to follow my instinct for inclusion, to invite everyone, always, even if it was the 10th time I heard a no. But another part of me was poisoned by the experienced voices of my colleagues. "You're going to burn yourself out if you try too hard. We've been doing this for years. Some kids just don't fit certain activities." I knew that. For them, this was pedagogical realism. For me, it felt more like a silent sentence of exclusion. I kept asking myself, am I pushing something that isn't there? Or have they simply given up too soon? At night, at home, I replayed the scene of Paul taking my hand and going to the music circle. That was proof that trying was worth it. But the next day, there was the team again, with that look of "you're wasting your energy." It was like walking a tightrope. On one side, the school's unwritten policy, the one that said, "Don't push, don't insist." On the other, my almost stubborn belief that every child deserves the opportunity to participate, even if the outcome is small. Because for Paul, that small had been enormous. That's when I understood that exclusion also wears disguises. It's not always a shout or a shove. Sometimes, it's an invitation that never comes. And the worst part, it was an institutionally tolerated practice. No district guidelines stated, in clear and unequivocal terms, that these children had the right to be in every event, even when, theoretically, that right was guaranteed by an IEP or a 504 plan. In theory, the law was on their side. In practice, its enforcement depended on how much each school actually believed in inclusion. And here, from what I saw, it felt like an option, not an obligation. There was no academic monitoring to check if Paul or any other child was participating in activities. There were no records, no follow-up, no consequences. Everything was left to the common sense of the staff, and common sense often came laced with complacency. I realized that institutional silence was comfortable for those who didn't want change, because change is hard. Inclusion is hard. It's much easier to say he doesn't like it than to ask what can we do so that he wants to join in. And maybe that was what bothered me the most, knowing that even when the law exists, without a culture of enforcement, it becomes nothing more than a piece of paper sitting in a drawer. That's when I decided that, if there were no clear guidelines or adequate materials, I would create my own strategies, even if it meant using resources from my own pocket. I started with the basics, almost handmade, a sticker and reward system, no technology, no apps, no complex spreadsheets, just paper, markers, and colorful stickers. But there was one essential detail. Each child would have their own chart, with their name written in large letters and a symbol they had chosen themselves. For some, it was a dinosaur. For others, a star, a heart, or even a rocket. The rules were clear. Every gesture of participation, raising a hand, singing a verse, waiting their turn to speak, or simply sitting in the circle, earned a sticker. It didn't matter if it was a big leap or a small step. I wanted them to feel that every effort counted, but the system wasn't just about rewards. Every day, before starting any activity, we reviewed the rules, and it wasn't one of those long speeches that get lost in the air. I used large, colorful images, made gestures, and repeated short phrases, almost like a refrain. Listen with your eyes, I would say, showing a poster with 2 attentive eyes. Wait your turn, I'd say, showing a smiling yellow clock. It was a language that combined visual, verbal, and gesture, so everyone could understand, including those who struggled with attention or auditory processing. Little by little, I realized it wasn't just about rules or stickers. It was about creating a predictable, safe environment where each child knew exactly what was expected of them, and where even the smallest achievements were recognized as important. The results surprised me in ways I didn't expect. Children who had once spent classes leaning against the wall, staring into the distance, began to move closer to the circle. At first, they came timidly, almost asking permission to exist there. Some took days to earn their first sticker, others weeks, but all of them, every single one, participated at some point. Even those who had already been stamped by the staff as difficult, as if they were lost causes. I remember the first time one of these students, a boy who always avoided group activities, earned his sticker. He didn't smile, at least not with his mouth, but his eyes. His eyes shone in a way that left no doubt. He felt like he belonged, and it didn't stay in the classroom. Parents began to notice. I received notes in their school diaries saying, "He came home and the first thing he did was show me the sticker." Or, "She told me she waited her turn today and was so proud." Small victories for some, but for these families, they were monumental achievements. In the end, I realized it wasn't just about sticking stickers. It was about giving each child the chance to prove to themselves that they could belong. And, once again, the contradiction bothered me. All of this worked, but none of it came from the state. No investment in simple materials, no visual resource kits. Everything was improvised by me. Stickers bought at the supermarket, posters made in my free time, and a set of markers I already had at home. It was living proof that, many times, What's missing is not a miracle methodology full of technical terms and expensive training. What's missing is political will, a minimum of investment, and, above all, the teacher's willingness to believe that every child deserves a chance to participate, because it's no use for the school district to sign posters with pretty phrases about inclusion if, in practice, they don't even provide a laminated visual rules chart. It's no use talking about equal opportunities when the teacher has to buy stickers, poster boards, markers, and print images at home to adapt activities. In the end, what made the difference wasn't an imported manual or a 3-day training. It was me looking at each child and thinking, you will have your place here, even if I have to reinvent this classroom every single day. And here's the point few people want to admit. Inclusion doesn't fail because of a lack of strategies. It fails when we give up before we even try. Then came the situations that tested all my limits. They weren't easy days, sometimes not even easy hours. In a matter of minutes, the atmosphere could completely change. A simple transition between activities, an unexpected noise, or even a sideways glance from a classmate could trigger an intense meltdown. Screaming, crying, the whole body tense, hands covering the ears, sometimes running to a corner and refusing to come out. Among so many situations, there's one day that will always be engraved in my memory. It was late afternoon, and we were all already tired. I was helping a student put away his materials when, all of a sudden, he lost regulation. There was no warning. A strong shove sent me crashing into the bookshelf. Before I could react, I felt fingernails digging into my arm, and moments later, the sharp pain of a bite on my shoulder. In the next instant, he was crying, screaming, curling up in a corner. I stood there, not knowing whether to tend to my own physical pain first or to the storm raging inside him. The entire classroom was silent. The other students stared at me with wide eyes, as if they had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. I crouched down, took a deep breath, and tried speaking to him in a low voice, repeating his name like an anchor. When everything calmed down, the marks were already there. Red scratches running up my arm, my shoulder throbbing. But what hurt the most wasn't my body. It was the overwhelming feeling of being completely alone in that room. There was no aid, no support teacher, no trained professional ready to step in. There were no protocols to follow. If a meltdown happened, it was just me, 20-something children, and a long hallway to the front office, which often didn't even hear what was going on. The school district said extra support was only given in cases deemed extreme, but no one ever explained the criteria for measuring that extreme. In practice, it meant that the outbursts, the crying, the aggression, and the exhaustion always ended up in my hands. I had to be the teacher, mediator, therapist, security guard, all at once, while also keeping the rest of the class engaged, as if nothing was happening. It's an impossible and cruel balancing act that the system seems to expect every teacher to pull off, without specialized training and, most importantly, without even the minimum human help to manage situations like this. That day, when I got home, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried. I cried from the pain, the exhaustion, and the deep sadness of knowing that, for that student, the explosion wasn't malice, it was despair. And I cried for myself too, for realizing that the system expected me to endure all of this in silence, as if it were just a natural part of the job. It was on that day that I truly understood that emotional burnout doesn't happen all at once. It seeps in through the cracks, until a moment like this shows you just how broken you already are inside. The worst part was the loneliness. There were no clear protocols for handling crises. No one came to step in. There was no support team, not even someone to take over the class while I took 5 minutes to breathe. Many days ended with me feeling like I was carrying a weight that should have been shared. Anxiety began to quietly settle in. I'd wake up with my heart already racing, trying to guess if it would be a quiet day or a minefield. Stress became routine, and emotional fatigue seemed to cling to my skin. And all of this had a structural root: the failure of the state. There were no school psychologists, no emotional support programs for educators, no real preparation for dealing with the mental toll on those on the front lines. It was as if they expected teachers to be emotionally unbreakable, until one day they break. I remember one specific moment. After an especially intense crisis, I stayed in the room for a few minutes, trying to steady my breathing. A colleague walked in, glanced quickly, and said, "Take a deep breath, Michael. It's almost time to take the class to the library." It wasn't out of coldness. She was overwhelmed too. There was no space, no time, no support for anyone to stop and ask, "Are you okay?" It was a silent cycle. Everyone exhausted, everyone trying to keep up appearances, everyone pretending they could handle it, until they couldn't anymore. There came a moment when I realized goodwill alone wasn't enough. I could have my whole heart dedicated to inclusion, but without technical knowledge, I was just reacting to situations, not preparing for them. That's when I understood that if the state wouldn't give me the tools, I'd have to go after them myself. There were no proper trainings offered by the school system, no financial incentive, not even released time for study. Everything would have to come from my own pocket, my own time, my own energy, and it did. I invested in courses on ABA, augmentative and alternative communication, crisis management, school inclusion, neurodiversity. Each enrollment meant cutting something from the household budget, a dinner that didn't happen, a bill that had to wait a little longer. There were months I drove to neighboring towns with the gas tank nearly empty, just so I wouldn't miss a day of training. At night, after facing a full day in the classroom, with noise, crises, endless demands, I'd sit at the kitchen table, open workbooks, and watch training videos until my eyes burned. Many times, I fell asleep on top of the books, with my coffee cup still full beside me. And in the end, there was no official congratulations, no mention at a meeting, no salary increase. The recognition came from somewhere else, quieter, more genuine, from practice. It was in the sparkle in a student's eyes when, after weeks of failed attempts, he finally pointed to the AAC card with the word bathroom and, for the first time, didn't have to cry to be understood. It was in the unexpected hug from a child who, months earlier, would only come near to push or bite, and who now leaned against me as if to say, "I trust you." It was in the note, sent in the agenda, written by a father. "Mr. Michael, he likes coming to school now. Thank you for not giving up on him. The work is intense." I remember that morning. George was restless. He paced in circles, his eyes avoiding mine, hands flapping. I knew he wanted to say something, but the words just wouldn't come. I pulled out the little blue folder I always kept on my desk and opened to the AAC picture cards page. I ran my fingers slowly over each image until he stopped, eyes more focused, on the picture of a glass of water. "Do you want a drink?" I asked, lifting the card. He took it with both hands, as if holding a treasure, and handed it to me. When I came back with the glass, I watched him drink slowly, his shoulders relaxing. Only then did he look at me and give a brief smile, a smile that, in that context, meant more than any spoken thank you. Before, when a student had a meltdown, I acted on instinct, trying to hold, calm, talk and often made it worse. But after a crisis management course, I learned that sometimes the first response is not to act, but to wait, to create a safe space, reduce stimuli, and only then approach. I remember one time with William. He started screaming, knocked over his chair, and curled up in the corner of the room. Before, I would have gone straight to him, but this time I stopped the class, dimmed the lights, asked for silence, and sat on the floor at a good distance. I waited. 7 long minutes passed before he lifted his head, breathing more calmly. I held out a card with the picture of a quiet corner and asked, "Do you want to go there?" He nodded, and we went together. There were no pushes, no more screams, just a boy who needed someone to understand his timing. Another moment I'll never forget was with Charlotte. She refused to touch a pencil or pen. Every time someone put one in front of her, she'd push it away and shut down. I had tried everything, or at least, that's what I thought. In the ABA course, I learned about positive reinforcement in small steps. I started simple, first just leaving the pencil on the desk without asking anything. When she tolerated it, I smiled and praised her. Then, I asked her to simply touch the pencil for 2 seconds, and when she did, we celebrated together. Little by little, the time increased until one day, to my surprise, she began doodling on her own, focused and proud. That victory might seem small to anyone passing by the classroom door, but to us, it was huge. That's when I realized, knowledge isn't just theory. It's what gives you the calm to wait at the right moment and act in just the right measure. Teaching is like planting. You prepare the soil, water it every day, and one day, without warning, it sprouts. That was where I saw meaning in everything. No official congratulations could give me what that moment gave. The certainty that, somehow, I was opening paths where before there had only been silence. And in those moments, I remembered why I was still there. Because deep down, each small achievement was a trophy no one else could see, but one I carried in my heart. The state might not see it, but I did. And that was worth more than any certificate on the wall, because what I had learned began to change my practice. I became more confident in intervening during crises, had more resources to engage students who once stayed isolated, and more creativity to adapt lessons. And maybe most importantly, I began to feel that I wasn't just surviving the routine. I was, in fact, building something. Getting trained was a turning point for me, but not for everyone around me. When I started applying new strategies, it didn't take long before I heard the whispers in the hallway. "This won't work. We don't have time for this." Or the classic, "You're trying to reinvent the wheel." It wasn't pure malice. It was the reflection of a system that never taught teachers to see inclusion as an organic part of the routine, but rather as an extra burden. The truth is, the state doesn't foster a culture of ongoing professional development. There's no real incentive to innovate, not in salary, workload, or recognition. Teachers who try to do things differently are often seen as troublemakers, or just too idealistic. Some days, the resistance was so strong I wondered if it was worth it. Like the time I suggested adapting a reading project to include visual aids and sensory breaks. Right in front of everyone, I heard, "Michael, this will slow down the class." I took a deep breath and realized that if I reacted with anger, it would only reinforce the label of the difficult teacher. Over time, I realized it wasn't just resistance to change. There was also something more subtle: envy. Some colleagues were bothered that my students, once considered lost causes, were making progress. It's hard to admit, but in environments where recognition is scarce, one teacher's progress can be seen as a threat. It wasn't open confrontation, but sideways comments like, "Of course he can do that. He doesn't have the same workload we do." The irony was that their success would have been mine too, if we saw ourselves as a team. But the school culture, shaped by lack of state support and teacher overload, creates a setting where every gain feels like a competition rather than a collective achievement. That's when I realized my biggest challenge wasn't just including the students, it was including my colleagues in the change process. I had two options: shut down and work alone, or make space for them to join in, even if they didn't believe in it at first. I started small. I showed concrete results without long speeches. A student who once refused to enter the classroom now joined reading circle. Another, who only screamed to communicate, could now point to a PEX card to ask for water. I didn't say I did it. I said we did it today. Some colleagues began asking how they could adapt their own lessons. When a teacher said, "I don't have time for that," I replied, "Then let me do the hard prep work, and you just test it in your class." Slowly, some agreed. One day, I saw a colleague using a strategy she once called a waste of time. She didn't give me credit, and I didn't ask for it, because the goal was never medals, it was change. What started as envy began turning into curiosity, and curiosity, when nurtured, can become partnership. I realized cultural change doesn't start with a policy or a speech. It starts when someone sees, with their own eyes, that a child can learn, if we give them the right tools. In the beginning, the changes were so subtle that only someone paying very close attention would notice. A student who used to sit with his back to the class now turned his chair to listen to a story. The girl who covered her ears during music time started clapping along to the rhythm. The boy who never shared a toy began offering a little car to a classmate without anyone telling him to. Over time, the small victories started piling up. Music circles, storytelling, and group games stopped being battlefields and became moments of laughter and connection. The meltdowns decreased, communication improved, and most importantly, social skills began to bloom. Not by magic, but because someone believed it was worth insisting. The parents started to notice. I received notes written in shaky handwriting. "He wakes up asking if he has class with you today. She sings the song you taught them and says it was with Teacher Mick." One day, a mother cried at the door and told me, "I thought my son would never have friends." Today he told me he played with two boys. There was one deeply rewarding moment in my career. It was the end of the school year. I was tidying up the room for the year-end celebration when I noticed it was taking longer than usual for the parents to come in. Suddenly, the coordinator called me into the hallway. "Teacher, something's happening in the gym. I think you should see it." I went, not really understanding. When I arrived, I found all the parents lined up, some holding colorful handmade posters, others with simple flowers, and several children smiling. In the center was an improvised table with coffee, cake, and a big banner that read, "Thank you for believing in our children." A father stepped forward, his voice trembling. This year, our group of parents saw something we thought was impossible. We saw our children want to come to school. We saw them making friends. We saw hope. A mother added, "Teacher, you didn't just teach. You gave us back the joy of believing that our children can do more." The children then came one by one, each handing me a drawing or a note, along with little gifts. Some had short phrases, "I like you," or "You understand me." Others were just colorful scribbles, but they all carried the same message. In the middle of the chatter, I realized I didn't quite know what to do with my hands. I've never liked being in the spotlight. But at that moment, surrounded by hugs, smiles, and teary eyes. I understood that this was the kind of recognition no official medal could ever match. But institutionally, nothing changed. There was no mention in meeting minutes, no career advancement, no bonus. That's the failure of the system, not turning good results into real incentive. On paper, my career looked the same as someone who closed their classroom door and repeated the same lesson plan for 20 years. In reality, the difference was in the children, and maybe that's why I kept going. Because the change that truly matters doesn't come from a decree, but from connection. After that tribute, I went home with a light heart, but a heavy body. It was a strange mix. My soul replenished by the affection of parents and students, and at the same time, my body screaming for rest. Because the truth is, behind the victories, there were sleepless nights preparing activities, weekends spent creating adapted materials, trips to training courses I paid for myself, and extra hours at school, without pay. It meant answering a mother's call at 10 p.m. to help calm a crisis, rethinking an entire lesson because a student had a sudden change in behavior, and improvising when the plan didn't work. In the school bathroom, leaning against the locked door, I often let it all out. The weight, the exhaustion, the fear of failing, silent cries, but so intense they felt like they were emptying my soul. Mental blackouts. Yes, I had them. Several times in the classroom. But the worst, the most embarrassing, happened during a meeting with the principal. It was a meeting to discuss the class results. The principal was talking about statistics, charts, goals, and suddenly she asked me to share an example of a successful activity I was using. I looked at her, opened my mouth, and nothing came out. The silence got heavy. I tried to remember the name of the method, but it was as if every drawer in my memory had been locked shut. One knew I had explained it dozens of times before, but at that moment, the information just evaporated. People in the room started shifting in their chairs. The coordinator gave a half smile, as if confirming an old suspicion. I sat frozen, feeling cold sweat run down my back. The principal repeated, "Can you give us the example?" I looked at the floor, took a deep breath, and with enormous effort, managed to say something generic, trying to cover it up. Inside, I was screaming, "Come on, memory, come back." When the meeting ended, I walked out into the hallway and leaned my hands against the wall. It felt like my brain had taken a day off without telling me, and I stood there, with a knot in my stomach, thinking, if they only knew how close to my limit I really am. The overload didn't just come from the work, it came from the pressure to handle it all, in a system that offers no support. From the fear that if I slowed down, my students would lose part of the progress they had achieved. From the institutional silence, no one to ask, "Are you okay? Or do you need anything?" My body started showing signs. Constant back pain, tiredness that didn't go away even after sleeping, and that constant sense of being on the edge. I smiled for my students, but on the way home, I often cried in the car. The recognition from parents strengthened me emotionally, but it didn't pay the bills. It didn't give me vacations. It didn't restore my energy. That's when I realized, if I didn't take care of myself, I wouldn't be able to keep taking care of them. I started carving out small moments to breathe, to say no when necessary, and to remember that a burnt-out teacher cannot sustain true inclusion. At first it felt impossible. I felt guilty for not accepting every extra request, for not staying late to solve problems that weren't even from my own class. But I realized that a 5-minute coffee break alone, a quick walk in the courtyard to feel the sun on my face, or simply closing the door during my planning period were like recharging my battery. I learned to say clearly, I can't take that substitution today. I need to focus on planning the adaptations. I started closing my gradebook on time because grading tests at midnight didn't make me a better teacher. It just made me more tired. I began walking early, before school, listening to music that reminded me life exists outside the classroom. I set aside one day a month to go completely offline. No parent messages, no demands from the administration. During recess, I swapped the chatter in the teacher's lounge for 5 minutes of silence and breathing. I organized my classroom so it would also take care of me. Soft lighting, reading corners, quiet spaces. I learned to say no. And every time I did, I realized I was actually saying yes to staying here, whole, with them. Because a burnt-out teacher cannot sustain inclusion. And I chose to stay present, and the results were immediate. Not only did my body thank me, but so did my students. I came back to the classroom more present, more patient, more creative. And ironically, it was by taking care of myself that I was able to take better care of them. Today, looking back, I realize I've learned just as much as, maybe even more than my students. At first, I thought inclusion was just about adapting activities. Now I know that inclusion is about changing the way you see. It's about seeing the person first and the diagnosis second. It's about believing that every student can grow, even if the pace and the path look different. I've learned that being a teacher isn't just about delivering content. It's about knowing how to hold someone's hand during a meltdown. It's about celebrating a single new word as if it were a college degree. It's about believing in potential that the child themselves can't see yet. But I've also learned that this fight can't be carried on one teacher's shoulders. We can't rely solely on the goodwill of a few passionate educators. We need urgent public policies that make inclusion real and sustainable. Mandatory, ongoing training for every member of the school staff. Resources tailored to each specific need. Mental health support for educators who face intense emotional demands every single day. This isn't charity. This isn't a luxury. This is a right. If I could leave you with one message, it would be this. Inclusion is not just the responsibility of the school or the family. It's the responsibility of the entire society. When a student is left behind, we all lose. But when that student is welcomed, encouraged, and respected, they bloom. And when they bloom, we all grow. I still believe, even without official applause, I keep going. Because the greatest reward has already been given to me. Seeing children who once sat on the margins, now taking their place in the center of the circle. In the end, I realized that transformation doesn't come from technique alone, or from good intentions in isolation. It comes from the courage to believe, every single day, in what you can't yet see. It's about insisting even when they tell you it won't work, continuing even when support is scarce, and starting over even when everything falls apart. Because every small victory for a student is, in truth, a huge victory for all of us. So if you are a parent, a teacher, a caregiver, a healthcare professional, a policymaker, or simply someone who believes in a fairer world, I'm asking you, fight for inclusion. Question, learn, support, and most importantly, see. Because when we choose to truly see, no one stays invisible. If this story touched your heart, help it reach more people. Like, subscribe, and share, because real inclusion is something we build together.